The Honourable the Prime Minister with ministerial arrangements.
Mr Speaker, I inform the House that the member for Blaxland has resigned as Treasurer. The Governor-General has appointed me to that office.
Order.
May I add, Mr Speaker, we'll leave that for another day. But may I say, in addition to that, Mr Speaker, until further ministerial arrangements are settled.
The Honourable Member for Kooyong.
Mr Speaker, I rise on a matter of privilege that's based on news reports concerning Mr Bill Ludwig, the Queensland Secretary of the Australian Workers' Union, and certain comments that he's reported to have made in relation to the unsuccessful challenge by the former Treasurer of the member for Blaxland. And I'm raising this matter at the earliest possible opportunity in accordance with the practice that the House adopts with respect to questions of parliamentary privilege. It's been reported in many places that Mr Ludwig has publicly said that if certain parliamentary members of the Queensland ALP voted for the member for Blaxland, then those members would lose their pre-selection. And the matter's received extensive coverage in the written press and on radio and television. And I'm producing for you, sir, extracts of the following newspaper articles. An article in today's Australian Financial Review entitled "Hawke's Key Queensland Bloc Begins to Disintegrate." An article in Saturday's edition of the Canberra Times entitled "Defender of Women Fights Also for the PM." An article in today's edition of The Australian entitled "Hogg Accused of Blatant Intervention for Keating, Row Puts Labor in Dreadful Position." I'm also producing full copies of the newspapers, and I trust that the extracts will be authorised as true extracts so that I may return the newspapers to the Parliamentary Library. Mr Speaker,
Order. The member for Kooyong will come to his matter of privilege.
Mate, there was no need to buy my own today. I heard it everywhere. I refer to the article in today's edition of the Australian Financial Review where it said, and I quote, "AWU State Secretary Mr Bill Ludwig has said publicly that those who vote for Mr Keating will not be endorsed by party members." End of quote. Now, it's my submission that the conduct of Mr Ludwig amounts to a contempt of Parliament in that compliance with his demands by the relevant parliamentary members of the Labor Party would result in those members being inhibited in the performance of their duties as members of Parliament, as members of this House. In this respect, the comments made by Mr Ludwig amount to intimidation or, at the very least, improper interference. Now, the Prime Minister is interjecting and clearly rejects this view, he being a comrade in arms recently of Mr Ludwig. But the mere gratitude displayed by the Prime Minister is not sufficient to let Mr Ludwig off this one. It would seem, indeed, that contrary to the Prime Minister's view, that others share my view. For example, in today's edition of The Australian, Mr Bob Hawke, the National Secretary of the Australian Labor Party, is reported in reference to Mr Ludwig's comments to have said, and I quote, "The raising of it, in my view, reflected the concern that exists about possible intimidation under the current circumstances we have in terms of the federal parliamentary leadership." In a similar vein, the member for Leichhardt is reported in today's edition of the Canberra Times to have said, and I quote, "I'm totally dissatisfied with the interference of the AWU, the union in Queensland," he said on ABC Radio, "and I find it a little bit distasteful that the Queensland Secretary of that union is now speaking on behalf of elected members of Parliament in that state on that issue. I totally disrespect the AWU and their part in politics in Queensland, and in particular in the Australian Labor Party." End of quote. Well, now, by Section 73 of the Crimes Act of 1914, it is a criminal offence for a person who, in order to influence or affect a member in the exercise of his duty or authority as a member, gives or confers or promises or offers to give or confer any benefit of any kind to or on the member. And that offence carries a penalty of imprisonment for 2 years. And it would be my submission that prima facie the conduct of Mr Ludwig falls within the ambit of this provision. But the question I put before you relates to parliamentary privilege, and I have made reference to the Crimes Act in order to highlight the seriousness of the matter under present consideration. And I turn now very briefly to consider the question of parliamentary privilege. At page 706 of the House of Representatives practice, it said, and I quote, "To attempt by any improper means to influence a member in his or her conduct as a member is a contempt. So too is any conduct having a tendency to impair a member's independence in the future performance of his or her duty." End of quote. At pages 707 to 708, reference is made to a number of precedents which give effect to the principle that I've just mentioned. In particular, reference is made to a report in 1947 by the United Kingdom House of Commons Committee of Privilege. There, the committee went to the trouble of elaborating upon the nature of the relevant head of privilege and what conduct may constitute a breach of that head of privilege. And to quote the committee, "It is a breach of privilege to take or threaten action which is not merely calculated to affect the member's course of action in Parliament, but is of a kind against which it is absolutely necessary that members should be protected if they are to discharge their duties as such independently and without fear of punishment or hope of reward." End of quote. Now, a restatement of this principle can be found in section 4 of the Parliamentary Privileges Act. Having regard to section 4 and in its terms, quite clearly Mr Ludwig's comments were designed or calculated to, or at the very least would have had the likely effect of inhibiting or interfering with the performance of the parliamentary duties of the relevant members concerned. And, Mr Speaker, finally I note that on the 13th of September of 1990, you had cause to consider a similar case involving a letter from a Melbourne firm of solicitors directed to the member for Corio. And on the 17th of September, after considering the principles and the precedents to which I've referred, you decided to give precedence to a motion to refer that matter to the Committee of Privileges. Now, the case under present circumstances, in my view, is far more serious than the case you were concerned with in September last year. And it would be my submission, Mr Speaker, having regard to the relevant law and the practice and to the ruling you gave on the 17th of September last year, that the matter under present consideration involves an important question of privilege. As such, it should be referred to the Committee of Privileges so that the House may have the benefit of its advice, and in accordance with Standing Order 96, I leave the matter with you to decide the question of whether the matter involves a prima facie case of breach of privilege.
I thank the honourable member for Kooyong. I will give consideration to the matters raised by him, and I will report back to the House hopefully a later hour today. And at the same time, I will give a report on the matter that I think was raised by the honourable member for Bennelong late last Thursday evening. Questions without notice. Are there any questions? The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question without notice is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please tell for the record the whole story of the Kirribilli House conspiracy? Why were Sir Peter Abels and Bill Kelty in attendance? Exactly what promises did the Prime Minister make to the member for Blaxland? Exactly what promises did the member for Blaxland make to the Prime Minister? What promises did both make to the union boss and the millionaire businessman who were their chosen seconds? And are there any other aspects of the deal yet to be revealed?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I want to answer this question, which I, of course, totally expected from the Leader of the Opposition, in a way which...
Order. The member for Forest will cease interjecting.
In a way which is least hurtful to the member for Blaxland and myself. And let me finish, and our relationship. It is inevitable, Mr Speaker, it is inevitable in retailing these events that there will be hurt. And I simply say by way of preface that I want to go to this in the matter in the way which is as least hurtful as possible. The fact is that during the previous term of government, the member for Blaxland believed that he should have a turn as Prime Minister. In that term, and we can't have it in that term. That one's passed. We're into a new one, as we will be in a new one after 1993. And, Mr Speaker, that was his view.
Order.
I understood it, and there was some pressure put upon me by the member for Blaxland. He had the view that it was either impossible or extraordinarily difficult to win the 1990 election. I didn't share that view. I believed that under my leadership we would win what would be a very difficult election, but I believe we would win it. I may say parenthetically, Mr Speaker, it was a view not shared by, I think, even the majority of my own colleagues. It was nevertheless one which I held profoundly. And I believed it was a very necessary election to win, because I believed that it was in the interest of this government that they should continue to be governed by a Labor government and not by a Tory coalition of the Liberal and National Party. It was my hope, Mr Speaker, it was my profound hope that the member for Blaxland would remain with me as the Treasurer in the lead-up to and in the fighting of that election and in the winning of it. He had a view that perhaps he may not wish to stay, and it was in that context the discussions took place before the meeting at Kirribilli. There had been discussions with him, he'd had discussions with others, and out of those discussions 4 mutual friends met at Kirribilli. I have not attempted at any point, Mr Speaker, at any point either to deny the fact of that meeting, nor have I attempted at any point to deny the fact that in the situation that I desperately wanted the member for Blaxland to stay as part of that team to maximise our chance of winning that tough election, that in those circumstances I gave the undertaking to which reference has been made that I would stand aside for him during the next term if we won that election. I've not at any stage attempted to deny that fact. I must say, Mr. Well, Mr. Speaker, no, I have neither attempted to deny it or in any sense qualify it.
Order.
Mr. Speaker, I'm saying that since this matter has arisen, I've not attempted to deny that fact. Mr. Speaker, it was the decision. Mr. Speaker, it was the decision. It was the decision of the member for Blaxland to reveal that secret meeting, and that's his decision. I'm not complaining about it. He's made it. I'm simply saying, Mr. Speaker, that since he has revealed that meeting, in that period I have not made any attempt to deny that fact. That's what my comments are directed to. Well, Mr. Speaker, either the Leader of the Opposition wants his full answer or he doesn't, and he'll get it, quite directly from me, and it's not going to be assisted in any way by this series of interjections. Now, Mr. Speaker, I was reluctant, as I have said, to give that undertaking to the member for Blaxland. I was reluctant to do it because I had then the profound belief that I would continue to be the one best able to lead this government to victory. And when I gave the commitment, I must say that I hope that as time went on during the next term that he may come to understand that, but I'm not in any sense saying that commitment wasn't given, but importantly it was intended. That unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, and I do not resile from this fact, that unfortunately put me in a situation where I had to, in the 1990 election, where it was understood, including by those at the Kirribilli meeting, that it would be fatal to go into the election saying that I would stand aside because the election was all... Well, let me... Look, Mr. Speaker, I am not going to avoid anything. I assume that the Leader of the Opposition wants a full answer to his question. I'm attempting to give it. And I would suggest if he regards the question as serious and he wants the answer, I should be permitted to give it without all this stupid interjection. Now, Mr. Speaker, the election was already being run in terms of a vote for Hawke is a vote for Keating. Now, Mr. Speaker, it was accepted as politically suicidal if that was the case. Now, Mr. Speaker, it was agreed. Mr. Speaker, it was agreed. It was agreed at the meeting at Kirribilli that no reference would be made to this fact, and for that obvious reason. I have said, Mr. Speaker, and I repeat in this House, that it was a matter of deep regret to me that those political realities forced me into that situation. The existing...
The member for Macmillan will cease interjecting.
Mr. Speaker, as I say, I deeply regret, I say it here, I've said it outside, I deeply regret that that situation was forced by the political realities. The political reality that we've got now, Mr. Speaker, is that, in fact, I will lead this party during the full term of this government, and I believe that just as I was confident, in 1987, against the odds, that I would lead the Labor government to victory in 87 as I did, and just as I believed in 1990 that I would lead the Labor government to victory, I am confident that I will do so again in 1993. Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't think that the member for Kooyong should get on his... Mr. Speaker, we do see that this is indeed a very self-interested question. A very self-interested question indeed. Now,
the member for Coronella will cease interjecting. The member for Kooyong will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister will be heard.
Now, Mr. Speaker, the latter part of the Honourable Leader of the Opposition's question related, and it was put in these terms of the union boss and the millionaire businessman. Well, neither the member for Blaxland nor myself make any apology for our friendship with the two people in question. As far as, well, I know I haven't been able recently to talk for the member for Blaxland on everything, but I know without any hesitation that I speak for him when I say that neither the member for Blaxland nor myself make any apology for the fact of our friendship with Bill Kelty and Sir Peter Abels. They have both been friends of ours for a considerable period of time, and I make no apology for that friendship. And I am not going to be moved in any way in asserting that friendship as I have before in this place or in the Parliament. I'm not going to be diverted in any way by the denigratory terms attached to Kelty on the one hand, of union boss, or millionaire businessman on the other hand, of Sir Peter Abels. As far as I'm concerned, I will have it quite openly known who my friends are. I apologise for none of them. And as I've said before, where there's any suggestion of misdoing, if there is any, let the cards fall where they may. But as far as I'm concerned, if I have a friend, I will not retreat from that friendship. Now, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable...
The member for Moore.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition has asked whether there was some secret agenda or secret deal. The answer is no. That is any additional... Mr. Speaker, he asked if there was any additional matter, any additional secret agenda. The answer is no.
The honourable member for Forde.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is directed to the Minister representing the Minister for Social Security. Would the Minister please inform the House of the effect of cutting $200 million from government expenditure on sole parent pensions?
The Honourable Minister.
Speaker, the question goes to the effect of a cut of $200 million in social security expenditure, particularly directed to sole parents. That suggestion, in fact, came from Bill Cole, who's a former senior public servant who now works for the Institute of Public Affairs, who suggested that sole parent pensions might be restricted to sole parents with children, only where children were under the age of 13. And that's where the estimate comes from in relation to the $200 million. Mr. Speaker, of course, the opposition, and through its spokesperson on social security, is considering at least as drastic a measure as that suggested by Bill Cole. They suggest that the area of sole parent pensions can be looked at in a similar way, and Senator Alston is on the record in that way. Indeed, of course, that's consistent with a commitment made by the Leader of the Opposition that they represent some kind of hardline alternative to our government. The Leader of the Opposition has talked about how the electorate will wear pain. But of course, when you talk about pain, the question is who is it that is to bear the pain? Mr Speaker, this approach in the area of social security, in the area of pensions and cutting expenditure, is, in my view, a very clear way in which we can draw a contrast between the government and the opposition. No area of income security policy, indeed of social policy, has been given greater attention by this government than the area of payments for families with children, including sole parents. A sole parent pensioner without any other income, with 2 children under the age of 13 and renting privately, is receiving $216 a fortnight in payments for children and rent assistance. Major improvements during the period of our government. In addition, we've instituted a child support scheme which enforces non-custodial parents' obligation to support their children. It's interesting to note that the proportion of sole parent pensioners receiving maintenance has increased from 25% to 38%, I think, in the last 2 years, and the number continues to rise by about 1,000 a month. The average amount of maintenance, Mr Speaker, has increased from $25 a week in January 1988 to $49 per child in 1991. Maintenance income, of course, is income tested against social security payments, so there's effectively a clawback in terms of the child support scheme. The child support scheme is then a kind of reform which is the hallmark of this government. The scheme increases sole parents' income while reducing social security expenditure. It involves creative and cooperative administrative arrangements between the Tax Office, the Department of Social Security and the Attorney-General's Department. Sole parents are typically only on pension for a period of 3 years, and we've made increasingly possible for that to change in terms of reduced time through introduction of schemes such as the JET scheme, the Jobs, Education and Training scheme. Mr Speaker, in conclusion, in relation to that question, we have a clear statement in terms of the Institute of Public Affairs. It's entirely consistent with the policies pursued by the opposition. That is, involves reduction in expenditure, and it involves necessarily a punitive approach to the particular recipients. That is, cut back the age of the children at which the payment of sole parent pension is likely to be available. The saving to be achieved not in terms of any principles of equity, not in terms of any principles of social justice, but savings to be achieved through punitive approaches which would denigrate and reduce the standard of living of those who are amongst the poorest in the Australian community.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question without notice is again to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, given that you have now admitted to a secret deal with a member for Blaxland at Kirribilli before the last election, exactly why did you lie to the people of Australia in the last election?
Order. The honourable member will withdraw the term lie.
Mr Speaker.
Order.
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister has referred to it in those terms himself.
The honourable member may wish to rephrase his question, but that term has been deemed by many speakers to be an unparliamentary term and should be withdrawn.
Mr Speaker, in deference to you, sir, and the Chair, I withdraw, and I ask the Prime Minister why did he deliberately mislead the Australian people in the run-up to the last election.
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I have already, in the lengthy answer I gave to the Leader of the Opposition's first question today, explained the circumstances of the meeting and the arrangement between the member for Blaxland and myself, and the reason why, for political reasons as to the outcome of revealing that, it was not so put to the people. As I've said, I regret that fact.
The honourable member for Moreton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question without notice is to the Minister for Aged, Family and Health Services. Can the Minister please inform the House what the effects would be of the introduction of a user pays system and/or a consumption tax on the frail aged in this country?
The Honourable Minister.
Don't you like it?
Order.
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Isaacs on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, it relates to Standing Order 144, which says that questions should not ask a minister for an expression of opinion. On the basis that the government are not looking at introducing a consumption tax, I would ask you to rule the question out of order, as it isn't in the minister isn't in a position to address answering that part of the question.
There is no point of order. The Honourable Minister. Order.
Well, I was interested to hear, Mr Speaker, the calls from those opposite about sit down, and I can understand why they're so sensitive to
The
this
Minister
issue.
might answer the question.
Because,
Order.
and I thank the member for Moreton.
The member for Gippsland will cease interjecting.
I thank the member for Moreton for his question and the member for Herbert, who have both shown a very strong interest in this issue, because they at least do care about the frail elderly and their electorates, even if those opposite won't tell us what they think. But before I answer the specifics, let's look at Australia's aged care system as it was 5 years ago. There are many tens of thousands of people in nursing homes, Mr Speaker, as you and others on your committee at the time would know, paid fees well in excess of their income, many thousands of dollars in excess of their income. And that's why people worried so much about getting old and frail. That's why so many of them lived in their healthier years, in their older, healthier years, in poverty and fear in case they had to go into a nursing home and cover those extra thousands of dollars of fees. But this Hawke Labor government's changed all that, and it's changed it in 5 years. More than 100,000 of Australia's frailest and oldest now have security of health care, they have security of accommodation, and they have financial security. And how has this been done? It's been done by an overwhelming commitment of this government to people and social justice, by bringing in a fee system linked to the pension level, along with a Commonwealth subsidy of about $22,000 per resident per year. In a couple of weeks' time, on the 1st of July 1991, in less than a month, no person living in a nursing home in Australia will need to pay more than 7/8 of their pension, plus any rent assistance they may be entitled to, for their good care and secure accommodation. And that means total financial, health and accommodation security for Australia's frailest people. Gone will be the days from the 1st of July 1991 when growing sick and frail was literally a frightening prospect. But that is in fact how people lived under those opposite. And that's clearly what the opposition are intent upon reintroducing. From what if you think it's rubbish, it's not rubbish.
Order. The member for McKellar will cease interjecting.
The opposition can't deny there were thousands of dollars of fees for many people. They can't deny that there weren't the systems in place, the choices in place that are there now. And from what we can determine, what they've put out in the small piece of paper they've put out in regard to their policy, they quite clearly intent in their policy and their ideology of bringing a user pay system and a goods and services or consumption tax. And that's what the real world for Australia's frail elderly will be like under the opposition. Because let's look at it. Over 90% of people living in nursing homes are pensioners. The government pays about 75% of their cost of care, about $22,000 per person per year. So what's user pays? What are those people, if the opposition were ever elected, what are those people going to pay on top of that 7/8 pension? They're going to pay $1,000 extra, $5,000 extra, $10,000 extra, or $22,000 extra a year. We want to know how much they're going to pay, who will pay and how much, because that's what the opposition have to tell people if they're going to be able to convince those people that they'll be better off. But they won't tell them. They won't tell them, one, because they haven't probably made their mind up, and secondly, because they're afraid of the repercussions upon people and the way in which people would think of them. Who's going to pay to build these nursing homes? Last financial year, $125 million was spent by this government in capital grants to build nursing homes and hostels. Their policy, or the options being canvassed, suggest that they will be gone, that will go to low-interest loans or all repayable loans. So who's going to pay? Well, they're going to pay. They're going to pay how much we don't know.
The honourable member for Isaacs on a further point of order.
I raise a point of order in relationship to Standing Order 145 with respect to relevance to the question. You ruled in relationship to my earlier point of order on Standing Order 144 that the question was in order and it wasn't expressing an opinion. I would ask you to rule on the basis of the comments of the minister that he is expressing an opinion and therefore that his answer is irrelevant.
Order. The minister is in order. There is no point of order. Order.
Well, I think people should have a right to know. The people of the 100,000 people who live in nursing homes and hostels should have a right to know what's going to happen. But what about a consumption tax? The question was asked if a consumption tax was introduced, what would be the effect? Well, we don't know because they don't say over there what it would be. We're looking. If you brought in a 15% consumption tax on the 80% of that $30,000 that is labour, then you're looking at over $4,000 a year.
Members of the opposition will cease interjecting. Order. Order. The Honourable Minister.
People have got a right to know who will pay and how much. There's no wholesale taxes here, no red herrings. The people have got a right to know who pays and how much. But let's look overseas for what's happening there. In New Zealand.
Order. Order. The Minister might resume his seat for a moment. The Honourable Member for Bradfield on a point of order.
I draw your attention to Standing Order 144, subparagraph G, which refers to hypothetical matter. Not only has the content of this answer been absolutely hypothetical, but the Minister has just confirmed to the House that he does not know. In fact, they are his exact words. In view of that, I strongly urge you to ask him to sit down.
Order. Order. The Honourable Minister is answering the question and he should... And the Minister will get to the answer of the question. Order.
We mightn't know what the opposition is going to do, but we do know what the effect of a consumption tax would be, and that's very clear. But in the United States, for example, under a user-pay system, let's look at the examples over there. About 1 in 5 people lack health insurance, 1 in 3 kids are uninsured, and 6 out of 10 people below the poverty line are not covered by Medicaid. Now we'll know really who will pay and who will suffer. Now the situation is that the Leader of the Opposition was quoted back in 1990 as saying, right across the board, I think there is scope for cutting.
Order. The Honourable Member for O'Connor on a point of order.
I take you back to the Standing Orders Standing Order 142. Questions may be put to a minister relating to public affairs which he is officially connected to, proceedings pending in the House, or to any matter of administration for which he is responsible. I don't think President Bush would want him to be responsible for anything in America. He is not responsible for Medicare or Medicaid, and he is deliberately wasting the time of this House to get his Prime Minister off the hook.
The Honourable Member for O'Connor will resume his seat. There is no point of order. The Honourable Minister.
Mr Speaker, it's quite clear the introduction of user-pay system and consumption tax would have a disastrous effect upon the aged and frail-aged in Australia. It's very clear that the introduction on the 1st of July 1991 of the 7/8 of the pension will give great peace of mind to the 100,000 or so people, frail-aged people in Australia, in our nursing homes and hostels.
The Honourable Leader of the National Party.
Mr Speaker, my question is directed to the Prime Minister and is without notice. I ask the Prime Minister, why did he not accept the member for Blaxland's proposal that a caucus member or members corroborate the agreement made between the Prime Minister and the member for Blaxland in October and November of 1988? Why did you insist on Sir Peter Abels instead, and so rank Sir Peter above all members of caucus and, in fact, above all Australians?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
I do not accept the premises of the question. I simply make this statement, that as far as these whole proceedings are concerned, in 1990 I made a commitment to the Australian people that I would lead this government for the whole of this term, and that is what is going to happen.
The honourable member for Eden-Monaro.
Mr Speaker, could the Minister for Primary Industries and Energy inform the House of the role played by the Australian Agricultural Council in developing policies for a sustainable agriculture? And during a time of undoubted hardship in the bush, what are the implications for the direction of agricultural policy?
The honourable Minister.
I thank the honourable member for his question.
Order.
As the honourable member has said, Mr Speaker, with the situation of the wool and wheat industries in particular, times are very tough in the bush, but we also recognise that some of the downturn and recession has not uniformly spread through the rural sector, and it is very important that difficulties facing individuals are more a consequence of, because they're more a consequence of specific commodity downturns rather than a function of general factors, that we need to ensure that at the national level it is important that short-term difficulties that farmers find themselves in don't contribute to long-term decline in sustainability and profitability. So therefore the appropriate response by the government is to ensure that the short-term difficulties The appropriate response is to focus on long-term structural reform, and that's what this government's been doing, not on short-term palliatives as would be put up by the people opposite, while ensuring that those who are suffering have access to adequate support. And quite by accident, I have here a report on sustainable agriculture. Members of the House who have an interest on this, that's mainly on my side, would be aware of the Australian Agricultural Council, which is the prime forum for Commonwealth State consultation. At its meeting in February 1990, the Australian Agricultural Council agreed to focus its work on the development of sustainable agriculture. The Council commissioned the Standing Committee to prepare a report on sustainable agriculture that would focus on the problems and solutions by identifying changes that may be required to ensure sustainability, examining research, analysis and extension activity needed to promote such changes, and recommending changes to government policies. Now, this report has been well regarded, and I'd certainly, now that it's been published, I certainly advise honourable members that it's well worth a read. What we've done here at the Agricultural Council level has provided initial direction and a useful resource development for the Ecologically Sustainable Working Group on Agriculture. Not only this, but the information that's been assembled and the analysis and the expertise of the contributors to the report will be of great value in implementing the relevant sections of the ESD strategy. And I'd emphasise what we have here is an issue of substance, not gloss, and it's an example of the government getting on with the hard work during very hard times.
The honourable member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is directed to the Prime Minister, and I refer the Prime Minister to a statement he made in the House on the 23rd of May 1989 when he said, and I quote, "We, that is members of Parliament, are all in a position of service, responsibility and duty to the nation where there is a fundamental requirement for integrity, probity, the ordinary decencies of public life and honourable conduct. It is a special responsibility of the leadership to protect those values by setting standards and enforcing them." Why did the Prime Minister abandon those standards by doing a secret leadership deal with the member for Blaxland and then deceive the Australian people? How can anyone trust the Prime Minister's word ever again?
Again, I repudiate the assumptions of the question. I've been in public life. Mr Speaker,
Order.
The question is assumptions. I'm simply saying, Mr Speaker, that I've been in public life for about 30-odd years now, 31, 32, and all I can say, Mr Speaker, I will have no worries at all in the rest of this period of office in doing what I've done through the whole period, that is going out and meeting. Well, you're asked. You're asking me, Mr Speaker, about the people.
Order.
I have no problem from here on in going out and meeting with and meeting the people of this country. I'll be meeting them in their workplaces, in their shops, their factories, wherever they meet, in their social clubs. I will meet them, and I am perfectly confident, Mr Speaker, of the continuing relationship that I have enjoyed with the Australian people over the years. And I would suggest, Mr Speaker, if there is any doubt in the honourable gentleman's minds about the view of the Australian people on this issue, look at their expressions of opinion in the last few days. The fact is, Mr Speaker, that I will go to them as Prime Minister with confidence and meet them face to face wherever they are, and I do so with a great deal of anticipation, because in 1993, as a result of meeting with them through this period of office, with the team I have around me, we will do in 1993 what we did to you in 1983, 84, 87 and 1990.
The honourable member for Dobell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question without notice is directed to the Minister for Arts, Tourism and Territories. I ask, would the Minister advise the House what stage planning for Australia's participation at Expo 72 at Seville in Spain has reached? Given 92.
I think the honourable member might...
It's not a good day for numbers, I'm afraid. Given the success of Expo 88 in Brisbane,
the member for
what
Mayo
are the
will
expected
cease
benefits for
interjecting.
Australia as a result of our participation
I warn the
in
member
Expo
for
92?
Gippsland. The honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for Dobell for that question, although I'd point out to honourable members that I'm sure that he meant Expo in 1992 in Seville. It's actually 11 months, Mr Speaker, to the opening of Expo 92, and planning now is very well advanced as far as the Australian government is concerned. And I'm happy to report to the House that the project is both on time and, importantly, within budget. Construction of the Australian Pavilion is scheduled for completion to fit-out stage by the end of this current year. This particular Expo in Seville next year will be a very significant Expo by world standards. It's certainly the largest this century, and to give members an indication of just how large it is, the site itself will be about 5 times the size of the site at Expo 88 in Brisbane. The theme of Expo 92 is the Age of Discovery, which focuses upon the 500th centenary of Christopher Columbus's voyage of discovery of the Americas. And consistent with this particular approach, the theme for Australia's pavilion at Expo 92 will be Australia Discover, Explore and Experience. The Australian Pavilion site, Mr Speaker, is located in a very, very prominent location. It will be a very imposing building, 5 storeys high, incorporating a series of exhibits, a 600-seat audio-visual theatre and a small rainforest atrium. Overall, the pavilion will be about 2/3 the size of the National Library, and it's expected to attract about 4.5 million visitors during the course of Expo. During Expo 92 itself, the Spanish government are expecting some 40 million visits during that 6-month period, and importantly, many of those visitations will come from the northern European countries, those countries that do have very strong economies, and importantly, from Australia's perspective, from a trade and tourism perspective, they will have very high disposable incomes, particularly countries like England, Germany, Switzerland, Sweden and Italy. From a tourism perspective, the Australian Pavilion will complement the marketing strategy that's already been put in place so successfully by the Australian Tourist Commission, and we expect that there will be continuing high growth of international visitors as a result of our participation in Seville next year. Importantly, of course, 1992 sees the emergence of the single European market, and it's important that Australia does seek to use its opportunity there, both in trade and tourism promotion terms, to make the best of that. And I understand that the Australian Trade Commission is certainly cooperating in that regard. I had the pleasure also recently to announce a joint venture between the Australia Council and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's ABC Enterprises was successful with its tender to operate a retail concession at our site at Expo 92. The joint venture partners, that is the Australia Council and ABC Enterprises, will consult with a whole range of arts industry experts in selecting and commissioning works for sale and will represent the very best in Australian art and culture. So it's very much in keeping with our emphasis in promoting Australia as a centre for cultural tourism, because a large number of our visitors who come here, principally as tourists, also want to experience something about our Australian culture, and recent figures of visitations to museums and art galleries certainly bear testament to that particular fact. Further focus on Australia's people will be provided by some 45 pavilion attendants who will form an integral part of our pavilion's communication strategy and certainly will serve as young ambassadors for this country. I am aware, Mr Speaker, of an enormous amount of interest in these positions. Indeed, I've had several representations from members on both sides of this parliament who have in fact sought some more information about these pavilion attendant positions. My department will be calling for applications for these positions in the national press on Saturday the 6th of July of this year, and we're certainly expecting a very large number. Qantas and Argyle Diamonds, Mr Speaker, will also join the Commonwealth as major corporate sponsors in the pavilion, and negotiations are already underway with several very significant Australian companies in regard to the pavilion's official supplier program. In conclusion, Mr Speaker, I believe that the next 11 months will see an important culmination of the planning, the funding, the training and the preparation by this government to achieve the most significant presence ever of Australia at an international exposition. All is in place for a very highly successful, highly regarded Australian presence in Seville in 1992.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question without notice is again to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, the former Deputy Prime Minister, Mr Keating, described your government as lacking energy, leadership, political strategy, esprit de corps, cohesion and camaraderie. In other words, your government is a divided, directionless rabble, which he believed will now ebb out of office. That was yesterday. What has changed?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
The view was incorrect yesterday, and it's incorrect today. Now, Mr Speaker.
Order.
Mr Speaker, first let me say that the view has been effectively and comprehensively rejected by the Parliamentary Labor Party this morning. It's not quite as good as the majority will have in 93, but it's good enough. Now, Mr Speaker, second, let me point out that the idea that there has been some monopoly on ideas is not correct. The situation is that this government, through the whole of its period and through this term of office, has had a situation where the Cabinet as a whole has made a very significant contribution to the whole range of relevant government policy for this country. Let me, without being exhaustive about this, Mr Speaker, it was the Minister for Community Services and Health who has revamped the social security system, directing resources to those in need, with particular emphasis on the family allowance supplement, who is comprehensively reviewing Medicare, and who was the original proponent of the Better Cities concept. And he will see those proposals through from his new post as Deputy Prime Minister. Senator Button has had responsibility for our successful steel industry plan and other industry policy initiatives, for truly historic tariff reform, and for initiatives to support research and development in this country. May I say, Mr Speaker, that the cooperative research centres, the Ballarat speech in '87 committing us to a microeconomic reform agenda, the Special Premiers Conference process with its unique ability to create nationally consistent laws and overhaul Commonwealth-state financial relations, the 1990 round of microeconomic reforms, including telecommunications and the role of airlines, and the recent waterfront negotiations were all contributions in which I was able to be very significantly involved. The deregulation of grain handling, the deregulation of oil marketing, the rescue of the wool industry, reforms to reforms to sugar, tobacco, citrus and dried fruit industry, the promotion of the interests of rural Australia are only part of the contribution that the Minister for Primary Industries and Energy, Mr Keating, has made. And so the list goes on, Mr Speaker. Environment protection, foreign policy, education reforms boosting payments to students, numbers of places at university and retention rates, defence with a succession of overhauls and equipment, manpower and contracting out to ensure that we have an effective fighting force. Now, Mr Speaker, those are simply some of the range not merely of ideas but effective policy implementation which has been engaged in by a whole range of members of my cabinet. But there's still a lot more that will be done by this range of talent, Mr Speaker. The following initiatives, Mr Speaker, for instance, are in train and will be delivered over the next 12 months or so. The Medicare review. While you on that side struggle for any health policy at all, we're doing what we can to improve an already very effective one. That's the difference between us on health. As far as the Special Premiers Conference is concerned, in that area, Mr Speaker, we'll be having land transport reform, nationally consistent rules for a range of industries, the National Rail Freight Corporation, and improvements to the state's capacities to both fund and to deliver services in this country. An ongoing social justice agenda, Mr Speaker, through Better Cities Initiative and through the amelioration of locational disadvantage by addressing problems of access to employment. The initiator of that is the Minister for Community Services and Health, the Deputy Prime Minister. Now, Mr Speaker, that will be going on, and there will, as I say, be the amelioration under that program of locational disadvantage by addressing problems of access to employment, education and services faced by people living in particular areas, such as the outer fringes of major cities and rural and remote areas. We will be seeing the sale of Australian Airlines, a new competitor to Telecom, genuine major productivity gains on the Australian waterfront. Internationally, well, you see, Mr Speaker, again,
there is far too much noise.
we have the suggestion that these people opposite know more about waterfront reform than the employers themselves. The employers on the waterfront are hailing these reforms as giving productivity improvements of the order of 50 to 60%. That's their judgment, not yours. Mr Speaker, in the area of foreign policy, there will be continuing major thrusts on South Africa, Cambodia, in the area of disarmament. There will be a continuing dynamic engagement in the Uruguay round, and we'll be continuing to build the economic, the political and the strategic basis for a secure and prosperous future in Asia. We will continue a fiscal policy, Mr Speaker, which will maintain the structural integrity of the budget while providing an effective level of support for the recovery, which will start to become evident in the second half of this year. There will be a further ratcheting down in inflation, and I ask those opposite who try to jump onto this particular bandwagon, all you could do was to give a legacy to this country of double-digit inflation. We've brought it down, Mr Speaker, where the underlying rate of inflation is of the order of 4%, and we will continue during the rest of this term of government to create what now for the last generation has been a unique achievement. That is having a rate of inflation in this country which is lower than that of the OECD. The first time that that's been achieved for virtually a generation. There will be a continuing focus, Mr Speaker, on the means of underpinning the major initiatives in science, research and development under the Clever Country Initiative. Mr Speaker, this is a government of and for the 1990s. It is the case, Mr Speaker, and I deeply regret it, that we have lost one of our better performers, and of course we have. And we will miss him. We will miss him. We've lost one of our better performers. But, Mr Speaker, Mr Speaker, I acknowledge that fact and I regret it. But I am saying that it has the resources, this government, Mr Speaker, has the resources, the talent and the skill, the will and the commitment and the purpose to emerge from this traumatic process through which we've admittedly gone better and stronger and even more prepared to put the interest of the ordinary Australians of this country first.
The honourable member for Burke. Order. The member for Moore will cease interjecting. The member for Burke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Minister for Trade and Overseas Development. And I ask, can he advise honourable members what action the Australian government is taking to promote Australia's commercial interests in the post-war Middle East?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for Burke for his question. I point out to the House that the government has three objectives in its post-war Middle Eastern trade strategy. One is to restore trade to the pre-war levels in commodities, which of course were our main export to the Middle East. Secondly, to endeavour to diversify both our exports and to countries in the region. And thirdly, of course, to participate in the extensive reconstruction that is taking place in the Middle East. On Wednesday last, I launched an information booklet on the Middle East, Trade and Economic Overview, which was prepared by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and was targeted at firms with Middle Eastern commercial interests. And the book just forms one part of our post-Gulf War trade strategy in the Middle East, which could be said to have begun with my visit to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait immediately following the war in March, and accompanied by a delegation of senior businessmen and officials. We followed up that mission in April by a series of briefings in major Australian capital cities, which informed the Australian business community of the trade mission and the perceptions of that market. And these briefings were led by Mr Paul Barrett, who's been assigned as Special Trade Representative to the Middle East, and Mr Charles Jamieson of Austrade. Already, Australian firms have reported the effective resumption of trade to Kuwait and other regional economies in the established products such as live sheep, grains, processed food, electronic motors and water purifiers. In addition, there have been examples of firms who already gained contracts in Kuwait. There's new contracts including Lincoln Electrical for electrical supplies and equipment, Exicom for telephone sets and ONGA pumps for water and other pumps. In addition, Mr Speaker, there are a number of other Australian proposals in new areas which are being evaluated by various Kuwaiti agencies. I can mention some of the areas in which those proposals by Australian firms have been made: in telecommunications, in port reconstruction, in palace renovation, in museum repair, in medical services, in education, in oil fire control, ordnance work, machinery hire, hotel refurbishment and catering services. And this is, of course, despite the fact that the amount of construction work needed to repair structural damage in Kuwait now does appear less than originally envisaged. Moreover, there are new areas of possible commercial involvement for Australian firms which have been identified in other regional countries, including in engineering, manufacturing and the supply of goods and services. I certainly will be seeking to consolidate further our successes and promote Australian commercial activity in the region by planning a series of joint economic missions to the Gulf region, which, subject to the agreement of the relevant governments, I will lead later this year.
The Honourable Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question without notice is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, given the statement by Senator Bean that some members would vote for you in today's ballot but for the ex-Treasurer next time round, I ask the Prime Minister, do you deny that your leadership is mortally wounded and that it's only a matter of time before the member for Blaxland mounts another successful challenge? Paul Keating has failed to storm the walls of the Lodge, but will the Prime Minister survive the long siege?
The answer to the two questions are no and yes.
The Honourable Member for Kalgoorlie. The member for Kalgoorlie.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Prime Industry, and I ask the Minister, given the appalling performance of the Wool Council and the fact that the pre-select committee that is to determine the makeup of the Wool Realisation Committee is heavily loaded with Wool Council hacks, and we can't therefore be very sure of the result of it, will he undertake to personally approach the Wool Realisation Committee and ask them to have a good look at the Todd Hunter zero coupon bond proposal, as it appears to be the only thing that can take from the around the necks of wool growers the 15% tax?
The Honourable Minister.
There's quite a few assumptions and premises in the honourable gentleman's question, and I think he should understand that there is a need to keep the wool industry well and truly involved as they manage their way, trade their way through the stockpile and the debt, and the wool industry has indicated its clear desire to do just that. And it follows from that that the Wool Council of Australia, which is the peak body of the wool growing industry, that they should be involved.
Order. The honourable member for Bruce and the honourable member for Higgins will cease interjecting.
You're right now, fellows? Yeah,
The honourable Minister.
There's been a long-held principle with respect to statutory marketing authorities that the levy payers, and that's in this case the wool growers, should have a role and a say in terms of who goes on the statutory marketing authority boards, particularly as they are the levy payers. Given the circumstances in the industry and the fact that the government and the taxpayers are also now well and truly a very big stakeholder, I've changed that from a majority of Wool Council members to having it a 3-3-1 split with respect to the selection committee. But the honourable gentleman also should take into account that the way I've specified the very boards themselves, where it's up to a maximum of 2 growers, there is really no way that the Wool Council, particularly from the way he describes them, there's no way the Wool Council can particularly dominate or dictate who shall go on the relevant bodies. And as well as that, the role and functions of the new Wool Corporation and the Realisation Commission is fundamentally different. There is no longer a reserve price scheme, which was the centrepiece of all the Wool Corporation's powers. So we have a totally different situation. We have a different selection procedure. He mentions one of several methods whereby the Wool Realisation Commission may sell the stockpile. I will certainly convey Mr Todd Hunter's proposal to Mr David Clark and the Wool Realisation Commission Board when it is elected, but I would assure him it is only one of many, many ways, and I have full faith in that board when it is constructed to get on with the job of removing the stockpile.
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Further question be placed on that vote.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, I move that so much